Good afternoon, everyone. And at the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Vitul Gupta and the organizing team of MAPICON 2025 for giving me this opportunity. And as Dr. Vitul has already said, yes, this is a topic which is right now claiming a lot of attention because the effect of drugs goes much beyond the clinic and the patient. It goes into the environment. So when we are prescribing, the ripple effect of drugs goes into the environment, and with the changing demographics, epidemiology, the rising incidence of the non-communicable diseases, easy access to medication, increased longevity, there is a huge amount of drugs that are being used. But when you look at the life cycle of a drug, it does not end at the patient that we prescribe the drug to. So I'm going to talk a bit about the pharmaceuticals as environmental pollutants, how that happens, how do they affect the health and the environment, and then finally some measures which we can take and which we need to take to mitigate the effects of these drugs in the environment. Okay, now we know that drug use is increasing day by day. There is a study which projects that when veterinary antimicrobials consumption is going to be more than 100,000 tons by the year 2030, and there are several other studies which are giving these kind of alarming projections. What we also know is that pharmaceuticals from numerous therapeutic classes, and there are again lots of examples, they are being detected in the environment, although in small concentrations in most of the times. Now how are they getting in there? There are again several sources to these, starting from the manufacturing units, then the consumption of the humans and excretion both through animals as well as humans, unsafe disposal practices, we wash down drugs through the sink or into the toilet or into our dustbins. All of this goes into the environment. It goes into the water, it goes into our soil, then there is leaching from the landfills as well as the agricultural land, and the drugs enter the water sources. Underground sources, fresh water sources, all types of water sources have detectable amounts of, albeit low concentrations, but drugs in them. And then there are point of source discharges from the hospitals as well, which add to this. Now the current water treatment plants that we have, they do not completely remove these residues, and the untreated wastewater sometimes is discharged into the environment in many parts of the world which do not have good systems. Now there is evidence to show that all of this drug residues, metabolized or unmetabolized, which are going into the environment, have the potential to damage aquatic life, the ecosystems, and they pose direct as well as indirect risk both to humans, all the other organisms, and the ecological chains. Now although we know that these risks are being reported, there are small and large scale studies which are reporting that there are drugs in the environment, but the lack of global coordinated efforts is there. All regions, all countries are known to be affected with this problem. There is no specific region which can say that we do not have this problem. Most of the data, like the other literature, comes in from the high income countries, but there is sufficient information to suggest that low middle income countries which are associated with poor wastewater, poor waste management infrastructure, and poor control of pharmaceutical manufacturing emissions are more adversely affected. Now when you look at literature, you will find several such reports. For example, drugs like fluoxetine, which are affecting fish behavior, which are making them less risk averse and more vulnerable to predators. Especially during the time of COVID-19 and after that, there is a lot of talk about the persistence of antidepressants in the waters. Active substances in the oral contraceptives have been shown to damage reproductive cycles and development of fish and amphibians, leading to concerns for ecosystem balance. Now again, this is a topic of great interest because there is a huge amount of estrogens which go into the water, both natural as well as synthetic estrogens, used both for humans for contraceptive purposes as well as in the livestock. But then there are several other factors which also play a role here. There are phytoestrogens, there are natural care products and several other chemicals which could also be implicated in these alterations in the reproductive behavior. There is also a link between estrogens and human fertility, association with some of the cancers with estrogens. In India, we are familiar with the virtual extinction of vultures due to the use of diclofenac. The overuse and discharge of antibiotics into the environment exacerbates the risk of antimicrobial resistance, which again is a global problem, and it potentially impairs the role of bacteria in metabolizing the organic substances in water as well as soil. Now there are concerns over this chronic long-term low-dose exposure to residues of multiple pharmaceuticals, not just one, through consumption of water, crops, through the dairy products we use, fish we consume and the meat products. Levels of some of these drugs like carbamazepine at times exceed those levels which are safe for us. Now, although these individual substances usually are found in low concentrations, but along with the other co-contaminants and pesticides and other chemicals, these may have a lot of long-term cumulative or synergistic effects. So this growing body of evidence indicates that there is a pressing need for urgent and global action. The UN Environment Programme has identified this environmentally persistent pharmaceutical products as a serious problem which requires urgent policy measures. So there is a call for action at the global level, at the national level. So let's see what all is happening and what all more needs to be done. So what we need is a global coordinated effort for a comprehensive assessment of the magnitude of the problem. There are a number of studies which are taking place, but they all use different methods, their populations are different, and we do not have good methods to estimate these low concentrations for all of the pharmaceuticals. So what we need to understand is the direct and indirect effect on humans, amphibians, reptiles, all of the ecosystem, so that we can get an idea of how huge this problem is. We need standardized methods to identify, assess and monitor the combined effects of these multiple substance residues that we have. Then we need evidence-based risk assessment so that we can identify the most urgent issues and then accordingly start dealing with those. We also need to remember at that same time that while we are dealing with these risks, the medicines and the drugs that we use, their benefits exceed the risks. So patient trust in the medicine system needs to be maintained. Okay. So what are some of the national and global regulatory actions? They need to be directed at monitoring, at reporting, setting of standards for manufacturing, wastewater treatment, allocation of responsibility throughout the life cycle of the drugs, including disposal, agricultural practices, and consideration of the environmental impact of drug prescribing and dispensing. So when we look around, there are regulations in place. The US FDA has regulations. In Europe, the regulations right now are currently under revision. They are looking at expanding these regulations to ensure that pharmaceutical companies, the prescribers, the pharmacies and the consumers understand and start behaving more responsibly. We ourselves have our own guidelines. We have the biomedical waste disposal rules. CDSCO in this year has released this guidance document on disposal of unused and expired drugs. So this pertains to the industry, the manufacturing units, the prescribers, the wholesale and the stockists, and whatever measures are needed to be taken at the level of clinics, government and private institutions. So in this guidance document, they have given recommendations of what and how disposal should be done and some measures of what should not be done. They've also given out a list of drugs which are safe to be flushed down because of the safety concerns of the misuse of some of these molecules. In some of the countries, we have this extended producer responsibility laws which are applicable, which shift the responsibility of this whole life cycle of the drug from the consumers, prescribers to the manufacturer themselves. So countries which follow this approach, they will shift the financial as well as the organizational burden of this unused pharmaceutical product collection and disposal from the government to the industry itself. Now, what is the role of the prescribers and the pharmacists here? So, when we look at studies, awareness amongst the healthcare professionals on this topic is currently low. This is not to say that all of us are not aware, but generally it seems to be on the lower side. As prescribers, our role begins much before we start talking about how we can prevent and how we can treat the pharmaceuticals which are in our water, in our soil. It goes to the level of can we prevent the diseases and reduce the amount of pharmaceuticals that we are consuming. Taking care of polypharmacy, avoid it as much as possible wherever applicable. Using drugs in a more rational manner so that our utilization patterns become smaller. Then we go on to awareness about what we can do to minimize the impact on the environment. Okay. So that is something that needs to be ingrained into now our teaching programs, into the CMEs and continuous education programs that we organize, so that we are all aware and mindful of this concern to the use of drugs. It is important to consider the consequences of inappropriate prescribing, and at the time of prescribing, if we could keep in mind the environmental impact of each medicine, then that would help to make decisions which are more environmentally conscious. Recycling policies are being proposed in some of the areas. So, when you are looking at redispensing of unused pharmaceuticals, there are some studies which have tried this, and they have done it, for example, where the package is unopened, undamaged, and the period between the return and expiry date is about 6 months to a minimum. Now, this is something that has been done in a few centers, and in the Netherlands they have allowed the certified pharmacists to sell the undamaged pharmaceutical products before their expiration date to other pharmacies, often offering a discount. There are some US startups which are functioning in a similar manner, offering drugs to patients with low income. Now, it seems to be a promising approach, but it requires a thoughtful implementation, because we need a comprehensive communication between all the stakeholders who are going to be involved in this, paying particular attention to the product quality assurance, financial handling and legal implications of this process. Now, green prescription is another newer concept which implies that the prescriber consider the characteristics and environmental behavior of pharmaceuticals when prescribing. For example, oxazepam is particularly preferred for the elderly because of its pharmacokinetic properties, but then it goes unmetabolized into the environment and stays there for several years. So from that kind of a perspective, when we use drugs which are metabolized in the body and are excreted as inactive metabolites, then those are the ones which are preferred. Collection schemes and take back systems is something that happens in most of the Western countries. In very, very small pockets of India, this is something which is beginning to get started, where we have our pharmacies which take back the unused drugs instead of those being flushed down or being thrown away into the dustbins. So pharmacies and the pharmacists here will have a very, very active role. So when they dispense, ideally they should also tell them what is the take back mechanism, how these drugs need to be disposed of. So there are some countries which offer incentives for take back schemes, and in Sweden there are pharmacy chains which offer some credit points when they are returned. So different countries are using different systems for these take back programs that they offer. Okay. Now looking back at how we manufacture our drugs. Can we manufacture them being more mindful of the environment? So yes, there are researchers who are also working towards this area to minimize the impact of the production and the release of pharmaceutical products into the environment. So they are using computerized drug designing systems to see how they can modify the drug structures so that they are more environmentally friendly. And these greener drugs, once they come in, they will also be contributing towards the sustainable development goals of the United Nations. So there are people who are working on better drug delivery systems. For example, when we dispose of transdermal patches or the meter dose inhalers with some amount of drugs still working, those are also leading to environmental pollution. Education is extremely important. So education of the healthcare workers, the consumers. So what we need is a change in the mindset, both of prescribers, the pharmacists, as well as the consumers. So there are several campaigns which are being run in different countries to educate the prescribers as well as the consumers so that we are more aware of the problem. So to wrap up, environmental pollution by drugs is a global problem and it requires collective efforts by all the stakeholders involved, the governments, manufacturers, healthcare professionals, as well as the patients. Thank you.